It's the same thing all over again. You've said those words to yourselves upon realizing the situation you're in is the same one as last time, and as the time before that, and the one before that too. I remember getting crossways with somebody and getting read the riot act, as they say, and just thinking to myself, way to go, dude. You just stumbled into the same ditch again. In the moment, it felt like no matter how much I had accomplished, no matter how much blame was to be shared in the situation, everything seemed just as bad as it had ever been, and I would always finally be a failure. This defect in my personality was never going away and would and does remain a thorn in my flesh. This phrase, most native English speakers understand thorn in the flesh, even if they can't identify its origin. It's rather remarkable how many idioms, English idioms, come to us from the Bible, some dating back verbatim to the earliest recognizable English translations. Our theme, St. Paul hugs his cactus, our theme, the whole theme gives us two for sure, right? Thorn in the flesh and Damascus Road experience, which we've already talked about. And one reason thorn in the flesh is such a potent phrase is that St. Paul doesn't over-explain it. There's still a bit of mystery around it. All right, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7. There was given to me a thorn in the flesh, as the King James Version puts it. 400 years later, in the English Standard Version that we use in worship, a thorn was given me in the flesh. Still use the same phrase. Scholars have wondered ever since St. Paul wrote those words just what he had in mind, and we can explore some of those ideas in overtime today when service is done, right? But for our purposes, we'll consider the possibility that it was St. Paul's zeal that led him to persecute Jesus and his church. That same zeal remained in him, and try as he might, it would continue to rear its ugly head in his life now as a fully devoted follower of Jesus. I got poked by a cactus just the other day, and no, I was not attempting to hug it, right? And even though it was a spineless, prickly pear, right, it still had those little barbed hairs, right, the glochids. And try as I might to pull them out with tweezers, that's actually what you're supposed to do, some of the microscopic debris remained under my skin, causing irritation and discomfort. Not quite a thorn in my flesh, but unwanted nonetheless in my fingertips. Now, here's how my friend Pastor Chris explains this idea of hugging the cactus, right, our theme. And you can go, as I tell you each Sunday, you can go deeper with this a little bit on his website, hugyourcactus.org, right? It's right there on your purple notes sheet. So to hug your cactus means for us, when one's life is not working due to a self-imposed crisis, embrace the ugly part of your soul long enough to become a person of humility and for life to take on new meaning. Embracing means both loving this part of self, for it's not going away, and yet seeking to rein it in and limit its damage. Now, if you want to catch up where we've been with this theme, you can head over to our YouTube channel. We got a playlist of all of the sermons. And if you need help figuring out YouTube or any of that, just ask Carrie or me, and we'll get you connected. Now, we began, right, we've been walking through this idea, and we began that with that invitation to consider the course grace can run in everyday life. Then we looked at the crisis caused by our own behavior. Then we moved on to the hope that transforms our suffering from shame to renewal of purpose. Next came the forgiveness from God that allows us to forgive others, right? Even forgive ourselves for violating our own ideals. And then most recently, we considered personal responsibility. That yes, we did those things. That was us. And yes, we do need Jesus' mercy and patience still. In fact, you can catch this past Wednesday on YouTube as we considered personal responsibility. We moved it from Sunday to Wednesday. Now, many of St. Paul's contemporaries would have seen St. Paul's ailment, whatever it was, as a vulnerability, right, as a vulnerability of his, right? Possibly something disqualifying him of being an apostle. His opponents, the Judaizing super apostles, if they had known what it was, well, they could have seen it as something to exploit for their own advantage against him, discrediting him and his message of justification by grace through faith alone, apart from works of the law. Right, we might call this, whatever this thing was, we'd call it his Achilles heel. Right? You can Google that later if you need to know what that is. Now, the ancient world would have viewed such weakness in a powerful person as a flaw that necessarily would lead to their downfall. But that's not what happens for St. Paul. By embracing his weakness, he learns not to rely on himself, but on God. Now, we kind of jumped in the middle here in 2 Corinthians, so let's recap where he's at in the letter. Right? Chapters 10 to 13, he defends his ministry to the congregation there in Corinth, Greece. Right? He states his apostolic authority. He responds to the accusations of the super apostles, right? That's his sardonic nickname for his opponents. And the super apostles have convinced the Corinthians, right? Remember, Paul's the one who starts the congregation there. They've convinced him after the fact to request Paul's credentials. They want to see his resume, his letters of reference, his endorsement from the original 12 disciples. St. Paul turns this around and says that boasting in his accomplishments and his connections is foolish. His suffering for the sake of ministry, for their sake, shoulder to shoulder in the trenches with the congregation, is all the credentials he needs. He then writes in the third person about this beatific vision in the third heaven that he was granted. But you know, he can't even repeat exactly what it was. And so just to make sure he doesn't become too puffed up and conceited by the mystical experience 14 years ago, right? So that would have placed it likely between the Damascus Road moment and his time in Arabia before beginning his missionary journey, right? So in that slot, right? So to prevent his becoming conceited by this mystical experience, and to prevent him from relying on that as the enabling, driving circumstance of his work, he ends up with this mysterious thorn in the flesh, which despite his prayers his longing prayers to the contrary, is not removed. And he must limp along with it, these last 14 years. However, what does he learn from the experience? Faith, some humility, dependence on God, despite his earlier training and learning about God. In fact, the more he depends on God, the more God is able to use him as that chosen instrument. Remember, that was the phrase God had for him in Acts chapter 9, and Paul cites in Galatians 1. A chosen instrument, God calls St. Paul. Somebody asked me earlier in this theme if we were going to end up hearing later on some kind of, something very pop psychology about embracing our sin and shame and celebrating our shadow side or whatever, right? Which I said was a fair question to ask, and then I asked for the person's patience as we continued stepping through the theme. See, plenty of self-help literature and videos and advice exist in that vein, most of which is well-intentioned to help someone move past what, Sigmund Freud would have called a psychological defense mechanism to avoid our own internal conflicts. And while St. Paul's reflection might bear some resemblance to sublimation or self-observation and awareness, that's not what we're getting at here. However, a psychological reading of St. Paul's Thorn is helpful to us. See, when you consider St. Paul's disagreements with his dear friend and fellow apostle Barnabas, and then the young St. Mark, right, like St. Mark of the Gospel, the evangelist, and his disagreements with St. James, the Lord's brother, and St. Peter, vehement, nasty disagreements. And then you consider his severe words to the congregations there in Corinth and Galatia. and his harsh words to the chief priest at his imprisonment in Jerusalem, and his eager and intense appeals to the governors and the soldiers, well, a picture begins to form that St. Paul's earlier former zealousness did not go away, even if he no longer breathes threats against others. When St. Paul surveys the hurt that results from his impassioned speech, it's no stretch to see a nagging accusation, right, leveraged by Satan himself. That St. Paul hasn't really changed his tune, only his team, which is surely bitter to a man who worked so tirelessly to promote unity among the early Christians, right, especially across the Jew-Gentile divide, as well as the apostle and the next generation divide, as well as the wealthy and the poor divide. More than once, Paul writes of his own empathy, sympathy, and compassion for those who suffer and struggle and sacrifice for the sake of the gospel. He wears his heart on his sleeve, especially in his letter to Philemon, mediating between Philemon and his runaway slave Onesimus. In fact, that letter, by the way, that very personal, loving letter, lays the foundation for the elimination of slavery, which had existed since caveman days. Right? You can make the case that slavery is the world's oldest profession alongside something else. Anyway, how harsh it must feel to the same man when his zealous words of good news have resulted in broken relationships. See, I don't think we have to try very hard to see ourselves in St. Paul's shoes. Each of us has had the experience of being misunderstood in a way that injures others, ways that we surely didn't intend, and yet happens all the same. And when we look back at ourselves from the other person's perspective, well, we realize our error, and sometimes, like Humpty Dumpty, it can't be fixed. As we considered on Wednesday, personal responsibility, right? Our need for Jesus' mercy, it doesn't go away. Chief of sinners, though I be, says the song quoting St. Paul, right? Though I be, not though I was. Indeed, our cactuses and their thorns make us ever more aware of how much mercy Jesus has for us. And if he has mercy for us, for me, then he has mercy for others, for you. See, these ugly, thorny parts of us, they don't go away this side of the resurrection. If we try to cut down our cactuses, they just grow right back, sometimes out of sight till they surprise us. See, on the one hand, that's just who we are. On the other hand, it's how we use who we are. And no, we don't have to be cutesy about this either. Try to find some sweet side of it, like prickly pear jelly or candy. There's nothing sweet about getting, say, yelled at and humiliated by Gordon Ramsay or Simon Cowell or St. Paul. St. Paul tells us in verses 8 to 10, three times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insult, hardship, persecution, and calamity. For when I am weak, then I am strong. What does he mean? In the humility of our thorns, we can only rely on Jesus to accomplish his purposes in our lives. Not our bright ideas left to our well-intentioned efforts that just end up sticking others. By keeping ourselves in check, by reining in our errant instincts, and instead relying on Jesus, our everyday lives show and tell him and his saving work. We even give God thanks for these thorns like St. Paul, not because God intends to harm us with them, but because they curb our behavior and redirect us to his grace and mercy. There, but for the grace of God, go I, as they say. In fact, wouldn't it have been fun if instead Jesus had said, let him whose cactus has no thorns throw the first stone? See, that's why Mel Gibson's advice to hug your cactus fits so well with St. Paul and his epistles. So when you hug your own cactus, you get a taste of your own medicine. But you also protect others and yourself from your worst, right? Covering up those thorns. You discover some humility. And then your purposes get transformed and renewed by grace. You and I, we become people of faith or deeper faith. And the power of Jesus, right? The power of new life, forgiveness, salvation rests upon you, giving you and me his strength for what you and I cannot do without him. Amen.